I wanted to ask you about a tweet that your dad left on his old account. And this is one of many. It's in a thread about dark family dynamics.
Hmm.
He writes that the foundational element of all toxic family dynamics is that the primary black hole adult in the home made it a priority to distort reality to ensure that no one would finally catch on, begin to interfere, begin to shine the light of truth, and be able to hold them accountable. He said that in October of 2018. Nicole, what is your reaction?
I understand after hearing John say things like that for many years, what his angle is. I find it cringy and ridiculous that he's speaking as he dreams of himself as a founding father, speaking with such eloquent, flowery language. Um, John is touching on a subject that is very much a double-edged sword. And if we're looking at John's perspective, what he is doing is making himself sound like an expert on family dynamics. Now, on the one hand, John does have training and experience as a therapist with his degree would in family dynamics. I'm aware of, based on what he's told me on his classes and his studies and his experience, that he does have experience in family dynamics. However, what's concerning is John, in his writing, what people wouldn't know is when he's talking about the black hole essentially sucks life from everyone in the family system, and that the people that are involved, I find it concerning that he said that one person, and what he's referring to is Trish. He's making a dig at her, and I know that because he would tell me when he wrote that he was really referring to Trish. So he's writing about himself. He's writing about what happened in the marriage with Trish, and he has a strange obsession with acquitting himself of guilt. He wants to write what he thinks people will think is helping them about family dynamics in a way that no one realizes he's actually talking about what happened with Trish. And um, he would rather, instead of taking responsibility for what happened that he was a part of in the abuse, he would rather act and write that he's the innocent spouse and that it was so deceptive, as he wrote, that he couldn't possibly figure out what was going on. And I want to throw this question back to him. If it's so deceptive, then how do you know how to write so well about it? Because you sure know how to explain it so eloquently. I'm saying eloquently with sarcasm. Um, when it comes to talking about, as an actual qualified therapist would refer to, narcissism or sociopathic or psychopathic traits, um, you know, it's ironic to me after learning and knowing what I know now that there can be, as John would refer to, two black holes, and that's what I believe happened in my family. And John is not qualified to speak on black holes as he is one. And so my perspective is family dynamics is a real thing, but sometimes it's not just one, it's two, and they both know exactly what they're doing.
I am speaking again to Nicole Uhler, the daughter of Jon Uhler, who is the subject of reporting we have been doing at the distance. Nicole, thank you very much for talking to us. You were magnificent in part one. Um, can you tell us more about what happened after your family began to decline in 2016?
Certainly, Matt. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the compliment, and I'm very excited to be here. So the storyline that begins right around 2015, the end of 2015, until the present day is quite complex. And so I'm going to do my best to break this down. What you need to know about John is he has a history of financial exploitation and financial misrepresentation in his public persona, as well as the business deals he's made with several people that he attempted to be business partners with. And overall, the financial aspect of John is one that I would say is very, has ulterior motives and definitely comes across similar to a scam. And so, backing up to the end of 2015, beginning of 2016, you have John is now still at Somerset Prison, and things are getting tense. As I mentioned before, his relationships with the guards and with the staff that were mostly the administration team that would that were in charge of the department for the psychological staff. Things were heating up. John was being scrutinized. And during that time, Trish, who was John's wife, we're going to get into that. Trish during that time was really running a lot of control behind the scenes. And for people that haven't experienced the type of control that certain fundamental couples have, Trish and John over the years would go to multiple churches. And so there were oftentimes 16 to 20 different churches that they became a part of, sometimes became members of. And their ultimate goal for both of them was to try to find people who were usually pastors or in leadership to start group slash treatment homes with. John would state that he wanted to have a treatment home for females, usually women or girls, and his goal was to provide, as he said, a multifaceted treatment approach, which in his eyes would look like a place where people could come, spend time, have their, his angle was he wanted to have their soul, their mind, their body, their spirit renewed, and have many different staff that would be able to provide different kinds of treatment. And so that was the angle that he was uh, giving to people when he would pitch his business ideas. Trish was behind the scenes writing very long emails, and these emails would be pages and pages of very hateful, vitriolic gossip that if the people in these churches did not agree with John, he would essentially send her to be the mole to write threatening emails to people in the churches so that they would feel compelled to work with John. And Trisha's emails, as I mentioned about John's spiritual abuse language that he would use, was even worse and carried this threat that if the individual was not going to participate with John, that God was going to curse them, that God was going to kill them, and really just scaring them. And Trish would, when we would go to a church, John would case the joint, as you would say, and he would find the people that seemed to be the most charismatic and the ones with the most power and privilege. And so he would go, and then Trish's job would be to talk to the wives and the children. And it was very disturbing that they were working together in such a fashion that was very calculated. So Trish's job was to find out essentially information that they could use later on as blackmail towards the couple and the family. And so oftentimes when things began to unravel at, as I said, 16 to 20 different churches, Trish would then be the one with John's permission and sometimes John's request to craft these emails and direct them towards the wives. Their children were these emails with these private details. And so, if you've heard of some organizations that they'll interview you privately, they'll get information, they'll use it as blackmail, that's what was going on. And so, the strange experience that I had was I was being quote unquote homeschooled during this time. Now, when I finished my high school experience, I had actually had to school myself. My mom spent hours every single day writing emails and wasting her time researching the Illuminati. And Jon knew this was going on. So in 2016, Trish was still behind the scenes working on this, but the relationship between Trish and Jon was very tense. Um, Trish had been, since I left the home, so I left the home around the beginning of 2014. And after I left, Trish began to become more controlling of my younger brothers. And also, she viewed me as a project. So when I left, in a strange way, she began to become um, overbearing and panicky that her project that she considered me was gone. And she started to exhibit very strange behaviors. She started to attend some very intense spiritual gatherings with women in the community. And she started to not eat. She started to say that she was seeing visions. She started to, while Lane and Reed were at home, and Jon knew this was going on, she started to go lay out in the backyard and talk to herself and try to contact spirits. She began to refer to herself, and I witnessed this personally. And then my brothers also witnessed this. She started to refer to herself as the Virgin Mary. She started to believe later on that she was pregnant at the age of almost 52 or 53 with Jesus. And she began to really start to, I would just say, go crazy. Um, she began to uh, come up to my brothers, grab them by their pants, grab them by their shirt, and tell them, I need to physically examine you because I think you have demons in you and I need to cast them out. And what's concerning is she was becoming part of this group that Jon knew about that believed. And once again, this ties into the whole Illuminati and the conspiracy theories my parents were a part of. And so in 2016, you have Trish, who's really starting to lose her sanity and become part of these groups in the area where they're supporting seeing spirits and demons everywhere. And it was really affecting her. She was becoming paranoid. She would stay up all hours of the night. She would start to talk very incoherently to Lane and Reed and say some very scary things that she believed were going to happen. Now, Jon, this whole time knew that this was going on. And it got so bad that after I came back from Sight and Sound theaters in Lancaster and I moved back to Somerset to an apartment, um, Jon was telling me what was going on with Lane and Reed at home. And keep in mind, they're supposed to be being homeschooled. No schooling is going on during this time. And Jon is fully aware of that. He was telling me that he was very concerned, but yet would do nothing. And I told Jon I would be happy to have Lane and Reed come and stay with me at the beginning of 2016. And Jon agreed. However, he didn't bring Lane and Reed down. They only came down on weekends to visit for the first 2 to 3 months of 2016. And during this period, Jon, instead of dealing with the issues that were going on at home, began to use more company time at work to build his websites. He was working on Church Protect with Jimmy. Jimmy Hinton actually came to my apartment in Somerset, and they were discussing, and they held this. It was called a symposium. This symposium was held in Somerset. It was about Church Protect and the sexual abuse that goes on in the predatory ring and just bringing an awareness to that. So Jon and Jimmy were working together. It was Church Protect during that time. Jon was spending his money and his time instead of dealing with what was going on at home to try to build this business. On the side as well, he was doing some in-home counseling groups with multiple women in the Somerset and Johnstown area of Pennsylvania in their home. And one of those people was, to my knowledge, one of his coworkers, one of the other therapists on staff at Somerset. Um, and so Jon was really spreading himself thin in an attempt to kind of balm and salve the wounds that he was experiencing to his personal pride and his personal life, in my perspective. And so instead of focusing on the unraveling going on at home and the concerning things happening to his own children, he decided to focus on building multiple businesses. And so around March of 2016, Jon made the claim, as I stated before, to me when he came home that he had forged signatures, and we discussed that, and he revealed to me that because, in his words, he had been stretched so thin at home and among the businesses, he had decided to forge the signatures because he was at, in his words, his wits' end and burned out, and he was afraid he'd lose his job. And sure enough, things unraveled. He was found out, he was discovered for forging, he was let go. And that whole process, to my knowledge, finished with him being let go around the end of April of 2016. Um, from the time that he was let go, he wasn't investigated by the state immediately and lost his license. There were several months, I believe it was about 6 months, and until September of 2016 when that started. But from the time period that he lost his position, Jon underwent such a negative and concerning transformation personally that I didn't even recognize him as the same person. And it really scared me, quite frankly. I was 22, I believe. I just turned 22. And I was trying to get my life together and going to college. And what I witnessed was Jon sitting at my apartment. Uh, Telling me that he had this whole plan of how he was going to save things because my brother was still a minor and he was still supposed to provide for my brothers who were still at home. So his version of providing that he decided was he was going to apply for positions, mostly on the East Coast. So he started spending hours a day looking for positions. He found a few, I believe it was three. One was on a place called Pennakees Island. That's off of, I think, Boston, that area. And what he did was, because he didn't have financial stability, he reached out to the church. I won't name them here in case they don't want to be named, but I reached out to, or he reached out to the church that he had been attending. We had been attending as a family for about 3 to 4 years at that point. And he requested from them, and I did not know this, but I found out from Matt and from Jimmy that this happened, that he requested about $1,500 to pay for the flight out to this business opportunity at Pennakees and the flight back. Jon went out. He had that interview and he came back. It seemed positive from what he told me. And then it never came to fruition. And I don't remember what happened during that time. Um, I then remember he went on two or three more interviews. And during this time, he was promising, as he always does, these big promises. He was telling myself and Lane and Reed, we're going to live on the beach. We're going to have this beautiful house on a golf course. We're going to have a completely different life. I can't wait to rescue you from Trish. And I want to bring this up that Jon knew since I was 16 years old, which would have been about 6 years before this, I had decided to talk about the abuse that was happening that Trish was doing when Jon was not present. Now, Jon certainly participated and knew of much of the abuse and was physically present and actually gave out many of the physical beatings. So he knows exactly what was happening with some of the physical abuse. But there were some things going on behind the scenes, such as Trisha's sexual abuse, that she was very secretive of. And I had brought that to Jon's attention in 2016. And I, funny enough, was following his own advice. He always told me specifically, probably because I'm female and he believes that I'm a target. He always told me, if someone is ever making you feel like you can't speak up, you can always come to me and tell me. And I am that safe person because, don't you know, I'm a therapist. I'm the person who everyone should feel safe to speak to. And he literally said those words without a couple of my sarcastic remarks in there. And so I decided that I was going to take him at his word and really test him to see, is he going to be the dad that I need? And so for the past 4 years, what had happened is, in a strange way that is very inappropriate and incestuous, he would have me tell him what Trish was doing to myself and my brothers at home and the abuse that was going on. And he would sit there, and it was almost like he was enjoying hearing what was going on. It was like he took it like entertainment. And then when I was about 19, Jon suddenly turned on me and said, you are the one causing problems. I can't afford this right now. I have to take care of your brothers. So you have, this was right after I graduated high school. You have 1 month to pack your stuff, figure out where to go, and get out because I'm not tolerating this. And I remember saying to him, I said, Dad, I'm going to refer to him as John. I said, John, I thought you were going to deal with what's going on. And he looks me in the eyes and says, with a very uncomfortable and serious look on his face, well, that would really put me in a very difficult situation because of my job and because of the businesses I'm building. If people find that out, they're going to have questions, and I'm not ready to answer those yet. And you are going to jeopardize your brothers and make them be in an unsafe situation where he potentially could lose everything. And he looked me in the eye and said all that. And of course, at that moment, I knew that he wasn't a safe person. I knew that deep down inside, he was a liar. So we fast forward now to 2016. Keeping in mind, he knows the abuse that's been going on. So he starts saying to me and to Lane and Reed, I can't wait to take you away from Trish. I can't wait to provide safety for you. I can't wait for us to go and for me to finally make $120,000 and for us to finally have everything we've ever wanted. And keep in mind, that wasn't anything we had wanted. That was his dream, his goal. So he then, after three job search trips, decides to quit completely. And unbeknownst to me, he begins, and I found this out later through his own confession, he begins to start online dating. This was before any sort of divorce had happened. This is before the whole uh, divorce incident. So he starts online dating. I found out later it was a Russian scammer who he had been in contact with. But to show how unstable he was and the addictive nature he has, he, even though he had a family to support, he had not gotten us on food stamps. He did not know how to do any of that. He waited until we had no food in the fridge. He waited until we had no finances. He made Lane and myself support him financially. And then he finally went and got food stamps at the last minute, but he refused to take care of us. He was instead spending uh, probably 10 to 18 hours a day online, emailing the scammer and spending his time. And that's what he started to do. Um, it was during this time that I was hearing more and more incidents that were happening at home with Trish. There was an incident where, and Reed, my brother, told me about this as well. She had drawn all of the blinds. The house was completely dark in the middle of the day, and she had knelt in front of Reed. And Reed at this time was about 15, almost 16. And she pulled his pants close to her. He's wearing pants. She pulled him close, got right down near his genitals, and said, I need to check your genitals because I think you have a demon down there. And John wasn't planning, he was staying with my at my apartment at that time. He had already decided that he didn't want to stay with Trish due to some tension that was going on because of me. And John walks in, sees what's happening, and then begins to tell me that this happened. I said, did you report that? I said, that's absolutely sexual abuse. And he said, well, I'm not really sure what I want to do yet. And so after that incident, Reed, at my insistence, came to my apartment in Somerset and stayed there. Now, keep in mind, he is supposed to be in high school. He's supposed to be getting an education, and he's not. So he begins to live with me. And then I was very concerned with Lane, and I mentioned to John, there's something that is going to get worse. I just know her pattern of behavior. Once she can't have control, she begins to get threatening and very dangerous. And so I warned him, I am not comfortable with Lane staying there. John ignored me. And it was about a week and a half later that all of a sudden it's a Sunday, and John gets a call from my brother Lane. Lane had called from the phone at a local restaurant, and Lane says, he's very shaken up. He says, John, I need you to come get me right now. Trish tried to kill me. John goes, what do you mean? Lane says, I we didn't have any food in the house. I walked in my sandals to Walmart, which was about a half a mile away, and he walked the whole way there, got food, came back. Trish confronts Lane for getting the wrong items and tells Lane, because of what you've done, basically saying, and I don't remember the exact words, saying something that sounded very threatening. And Lane said she goes in the bedroom, she closes the door, and under my parents' metal bed frame were several large guns, and there was a gun case, and you could hear if the gun case was being pulled out because the metal bed frame would make a very specific noise. And Lane heard that noise, and he heard the gun being loaded, and he heard the clicking of the cartridge being back and getting ready to fire. And Lane said that as she begins to open the bedroom door, he runs out barefoot and ran to this restaurant to call because he felt so unsafe. Now, I had told Jon, this is my own version, that I was afraid for Lane's life. Lane had always been a target growing up. And I had, as I said before, Jon and Trish had threatened to kill us and make us homeless multiple times. So at that point, I was extremely angry with Jon, and Lane came to live with me during that incident. And it was quite shocking that Jon did nothing. He did absolutely nothing. He, in fact, started using that trauma and started telling everyone at the same church that had given him the $1,500 what happened. And he began to disclose all of this and say, in a strange way, because of what's happening in my home, I'm even more qualified as a trauma therapist. And he began telling people our personal details. So right after that, there were several times where Reed was still working up in Johnstown. He was down at my apartment. And so there was one week where Jon said, do you want to go stay back with Trish so you can easily get to school? Reed had been enrolled in the local school suddenly. And do you want to walk to work? So that's what happened. Well, Jon had dropped Reed off about 3 days before, and I am at work. I come back to my apartment to find Jon and Reed standing in my apartment. And I'm confused and I say, oh, well, thanks for visiting. It's nice to see you. Jon goes, no, uh, Trish just jumped off the balcony and she's at the hospital. And I'm very confused. I say, what? He says, Reed Reed was getting ready to walk home from work, and I told him, let's go out to eat and have some father-son time. So I pick Reed up, we go out to eat, we come back, I pull to the edge of the driveway, and I see her laying there in the dirt and on the sidewalk. And Reed and I get out. We're very confused. We think she's sun tanning, and we walk over. She's in a daze. She's out of it. We don't know later on, as the images showed, that several of her spinal discs were fractured and broken. And so we help her stand up. She walks up the steps and we lay her down. And again, Jon and Reed both told me after I asked details. I said, did you see any blood? Was there any kind of graphic evidence? And both of them said no. They said she just seemed dazed and out of it. She never said her back hurt. She never said any of that. We laid her down, and then Jon called 911 and had the ambulance come pick her up and was taken to the hospital. And that's when Jon brought Reed down to my apartment. When I first moved back to Somerset after coming during that time of sight and sound, and I came back, um, Trish came and stalked me at my apartment. And it was because Jon, unfortunately, did not respect my boundaries. He brought one of my pieces of mail with my address back up to Johnstown. So Trish found out where I lived. I saw her car going right in front of my apartment multiple times on 2 separate days. And I told Jon about this. And so I knew if she was the type of person to stalk her daughter, and I had set boundaries with Trish 2 years prior, and I had gone no contact, and that's why Trish was stalking me. I knew she was the type of person to be very unsafe and do something crazy, like jump off of the balcony. And so, about a week before she jumped, I told Jon, now that Reed is here, now that Lane is here, now that you are staying here, she is going to try to do something that's very dangerous to get attention because she's angry that she doesn't have control. And sure enough, when she jumped, I remember later that day being so angry and yelling at my dad and screaming and crying and saying, I told you that this was going to happen. Why didn't you listen to me? Poor Reed had to see this. Why didn't you do what I said and what I asked? As I said before, I'd asked to be a guardian of Lane and Reed prior to this happening. So it was very upsetting to me that my brothers are trying to finish school, that I'm just trying to be a young adult, and suddenly I'm being thrown into the middle of this very dangerous and crazy situation. So Trish was in the intensive care unit, was awaiting surgery to have some titanium, I believe, rods or plates put into her spine. And Jon goes to the intensive care unit for 5 days in a row. And the first day he went, I told him, I said, "Are you sure you want to go?" She jumped to get attention, and you going is only going to make it worse. Jon says, "Well, I feel like it's the right thing to do. I feel like I should do that." I said, "Okay." So he goes to the hospital, he comes back, and I say, "What happened?" He says, "Well, you know her. She refused to see me. I see her feet in the room. I hear her voice say, 'I don't want to speak to that man. Get him out of here.'" And I said, "I told you." I said, "She's going to purposely make it seem like she's the victim." So then Jon goes back the next day and the next day and the next day for 5 days. And every day she refused to see him. Now, for people that might think she was traumatized and she was the type of person who was scared of Jon, I want to really nail down the fact that it could be the opposite. Trish was very threatening, and she would have had no reason that I ever saw. And I was home all of the time growing up. I never saw Jon threaten Trish. I saw Trish threaten Jon. I saw her get in his face. I saw her be the one who was the physical aggressor. And so I just want to say, most of the time you hear of females being the one that are being abused. In this case, Trish was, to my knowledge, always the aggressor. Jon certainly had his share of issues, but when it came to marital relationship, Trish was 99% of the time responsible for the arguments, was responsible for. So Trish was known for being very belligerent and could get physically aggressive, could be um, abusive in every single way possible, including sexually. Now, the sexual abuse for us did not include fondling or touching genitals in a very explicit way. However, our bodies were made to be completely undressed. We were touched in different places. We were looked at and groped by Trish, and sexual abuse certainly was present. So, in my experience, in what I saw, Trish would lie multiple times a day about just anything. She was extremely untrustworthy. She would say anything to get her way. She was one of the most manipulative people I've ever met in my entire life. And she had a history of talking about violence, that she would pray that someone would be killed if they made her angry. And like I said, she threatened us multiple times with death and with being shot with a gun. And so her jumping, I knew she would try something like that if I set boundaries with her. And so when this whole incident happened, I wasn't surprised. But what happened was, in the hospital now for the surgery, and she's had the surgery, she's in post recovery, and suddenly Jon gets a call from the Johnstown detective. The detective says, "Are you Jon Uhler?" He says, "Yes." He says, "Is Trish Uhler your wife?" He says, "Yes." And he says, "Your wife Trish alleges that you have a sex slave dungeon set up in your basement, and that her whole marriage, which was about 22 years at that point, um, your whole marriage, you've kept her in the basement, you've raped her, you whipped her, you starved her, and she's calling to report to say that you're a very dangerous and scary man, and she wants to report you and press charges." And I start laughing. And even though that might sound a little bit shocking, I start laughing because I told Jon, she sees you coming to the hospital, you're triggering her thinking she has power, she's going to try something else. And so I start laughing. I said, "Dad, she has never been to the basement more than once a year in her entire life, ever since we've been in that house for the past 15 years. I said, "She has made me do all of the trips to the basement to clean, to get our pantry food." I said, "She doesn't even know what the basement looks like." And I personally had seen the basement hundreds of thousands of times, and there was absolutely nothing like that going on. In fact, and this seems a slightly inappropriate detail. However, my dad shared this with me, and I think this is key to talk about their relationship. Jon actually shared with me on multiple occasions, without any shame or embarrassment, that Trish withheld marital intimacy and they would only have intimacy about once a year maximum. And so the fact that we three were born really spoke to that's about how frequent it was happening. And so Jon shares that based on how frequently Trish would refuse marital intimacy, how could that possibly be flipped? And so he sits down with the detective. He explains to the detective, "You're free to come check out our basement. This is the situation." And I told Jon, "Please let the detective know. I would like to share my perspective." So about 2 days later, the detective has me in, and I begin to unload the real truth that I've experienced. He asks me questions about what Trish had alleged, and I answered them. And by the time we were done, the detective has a look on his face that he understands that these are false allegations. And Trish is still in the hospital at that point. Jon and Lane and Reed are still down at my Somerset apartment, even though no one is living at the house apartment that Jon and Trish and Lane and Reed were living in Johnstown. So that house is empty. They're living in my Somerset apartment, and Jon begins to realize that Trish is going to need to be cared for with physical therapy and all that. So Jon is not having that. He calls Trish's family, who is up in Vancouver, Canada. He requests that they come down, that they take Trish up to Canada, specifically also because Trish was refusing to see Jon and talk with him. And so Trish's mother and older sister come down a few days later. They come into our house in Johnstown without permission. As they came in our house, her mother and her older sister, without my father's knowledge or permission, without my knowledge or permission, they came into the house when my dad was either working or gone, and they stole thousands of dollars worth of my mother's jewelry, wedding rings, her wedding dress. Parts of my personal collection in my room, things from the basement that my parents had saved for me for my wedding and for my marriage. And they stole, according to my dad, when he realized how much was taken, approximately 13 full big black garbage bags of items. And Trish gave no pushback on that. And Trish had promised those items to me. And they were worth probably about $30,000. So they took a significant amount. Um, Trish and her sister and mother then leave from the Pittsburgh airport to go back to Vancouver to help her recuperate. Jon is still at my apartment with Lane and Reed. And then Jon, instead of looking for a job, again, he's unemployed during this entire time. He then says, "Nicole, it looks like I'm going to need you to come take care of Lane and Reed. So I'm going to have you we're gonna get rid of this apartment in Somerset, which by the way he had told me was mine. And we had decorated. We had done a full refurbishing of my apartment. We had put in approximately $5,000 to $6,000 that he had used to refurbish my apartment. And then they were living there. So I felt like that was fair since I had let them come down, though it was supposed to be mine. Uh, so I had to get rid of that apartment that I loved. I had to go back up to Johnstown. This whole experience happened within about 3 weeks. So this was in around June of 2016. So Trish is now gone, and now I have to be traumatized by being brought back to my childhood home where all of the abuse happens. And strangely enough, Jon tells me, "Hey, if you don't want to sleep in your childhood bedroom, which is right across the hall on the same floor," he goes, "you can come sleep in the bedroom and sleep in the bed with me if you'd like." Now, it would make sense if I explained to you that there were so many bad memories from that bedroom and there were no other bedrooms. And so I said yes, but I would make a pillow wall because I felt very uncomfortable with that. And that was the only sleeping arrangement that I had. And so my dad brought all of us back. Lane and Reed and me were all in this house that we grew up in. And instead of starting job searching and taking this seriously, because we have no income other than Jon's $1,000 a month, which doesn't stretch far, Jon begins to tell myself and Lane, "Hey, since you both are working," and keep in mind I had to let two of my jobs go in Somerset, one of which I was a manager and was making pretty good income. I was working three jobs at the time, so I had to let those two jobs go. I finally got an extra job up in Johnstown. And he says, "Since you and Lane are working and you can cover the rest of my bills, I'm going to go ahead and do one of my goals that I've always wanted that Trish has blocked me from doing." And I remember looking at him thinking, what are you pulling right now? And he says, I've always wanted to get my license, but Trish has always prevented me from getting a license because of how chaotic she was. Now, the truth is, because of Jon's long abusive conversations with us, which would be 12 hours per night, about 2 to 3 days a week, because of the fact that he would spend money building businesses, because of the fact that he would allow my mother to purchase very expensive health items that we could not afford, he had already filed bankruptcy. He was close to having to file bankruptcy in 2016 again, and had spent all of this money at this apartment that then was not brought to fruition. Now he's in serious debt. And so he then decides, and this is what happened, that Lane and I, who are working minimum wage jobs, and I'm trying, oh, and then I had to quit college in Somerset and come up. So I'm in the middle of just trying to support myself. And so now we're paying the bills. And Jon is supposed to be studying, according to him. He gets the material for licensing, and within about a week, he begins to get distracted again. And keep in mind, the Russian scammer has already happened. He's already been doing online dating. Doesn't tell me until I suddenly realize something weird is going on. And I ask him about it. And he finally tells me with a guilty look on his face. He then was going to have this Russian woman come stay in our house only about 3 weeks after starting to contact her. And he was serious about that. He was going to use his money and our money to bring her over and have her stay. He planned on marrying her. Keep in mind, Trish has just gone up to Canada. And the real truth is, Jon cannot handle being alone. Jon does not want to have to. And while I was up in the house, in Johnstown, he had me do all the cooking, the cleaning, the grocery shopping. And he refused to do any laundry or anything like that. And so he really wanted a female to do all of the tasks so he could build his businesses. And I say plural because there were multiple businesses he was still working on. He's still working with Jimmy Hinton during this time. And unbeknownst to me, he reached out to Jimmy Hinton to request that the church find housing and find a place for me and Lane and Reed to stay instead of reporting and dealing with the abuse that was going on with Trish. And I also want to throw in really quickly, I had requested since around 2010 that Jon divorce Trish and that he request that she leave and that she go to Canada or wherever she chose to. And keep in mind, she had a bachelor's in business administration. She would have been absolutely fine. And Jon refused. And so it was awfully tacky and hypocritical of him to suddenly be requesting for a place for myself and my brothers to stay when things got that urgent and dire, and he let them fall apart. And so I had already asked him for the past 6 to 8 years for her to leave and for him to report her to the police, and he did not. So he's requesting money and he's requesting for the church to house us. And I did not know any of this until I was told by Matt and Jimmy. So now we're alone in the house. Jon is having myself and Lane provide and support him. I'm not allowed to have any financial assistance. I'm not allowed to keep any of the money I'm making. So Jon is supposed to be studying. What he does instead is I see him shut himself in the den slash study that we had for about 18 hours a day. And I begin to hear him typing and talking to someone. And I wasn't Snoopy, but you could hear through the door pretty clearly. So since I'm paying for housing, I start going, I should kind of know what's going on because now I'm involved. And I start getting suspicious that there's something else going on. So I ask Jon. I confront him again. He has another guilty look on his face and he says, oh, something crazy has happened. And God gave me a dream in the middle of the night a couple days ago that I should reach out to my old high school sweetheart, Susan. And instantly my heart dropped because I had met Susan. And I had suspicions that when he requested for me to start getting to know her, when I was spending time with my grandparents, with his parents, Jon's parents, that there was something fishy going on. And it was back in 2014 that Jon had directed and had connected myself and Susan. And I did suspect during that time that there was some kind of a motive that Jon had in wanting to get back together with Susan. He talked to me about how they used to know each other as teens. Well, Jon tells me God told me that she's the person I'm supposed to marry. And keep in mind, this is the beginning of July. This is about mid July. Reed is about to turn 16. And he says, It's unbelievable. This is such an amazing miracle. I can't believe that God has answered my prayers. And I'm standing there with my mouth open. And I say, what do you mean God has answered your prayers? He said, well, I've never told you this before, but I have to tell you, I prayed to the Lord and I asked him for three specific miracles. So I knew that it was the right time to divorce your mother. Now, keep in mind, Jon has not filed for divorce at this point. Trish has not filed for divorce. There's no divorce on the table. And Jon is still wearing his wedding ring, by the way. And so he says the first prayer was that Trish would remove her wedding ring. The second one was that she would smash and break and take down our wedding pictures in our bedroom. And the third one is that she would tell me to my face, I don't want to be married to you anymore. And he said, those three things have now happened because Jon had shared with me that Trish had done those three things, which I did witness the pictures being gone in their bedroom when I moved back to Johnstown. And she apparently had done all those three things. So Jon was claiming that God had used that as a sign, even though prior to that I had requested that he divorce and I knew that that was the right thing for him to do. He just made up a reason why it wasn't time yet and that he needed very clear guidance, quote unquote, from God. And so he told me those three signs had happened. And so he knew that it was the right time to be getting remarried, to be dating, only 2 months after this entire thing, or maybe even a month had happened. So he begins to spend 18 hours a day, sometimes 20, talking with Susan, who's in California. He begins to video call her for hours, for days and for weeks, and this went on for at least over a month. And during this time, Lane and I are starting to get very frustrated and very confused. We're supporting him. He's not studying. He has the material. He's not doing any of what he said. We're here feeling used. Lane hadn't yet finished high school. I want to make that clear. Trish had not homeschooled him. She had stopped schooling because she was going so crazy. And so Lane had not finished his high school yet. So here he is working. No school is happening. Reed is going to the public school, and Reed is needing me to take him because Jon is throwing his hands up. And so I'm driving Reed to sports events. I'm being a parent at this point. And Jon suddenly tells me, and this is in August, end of August, Jon suddenly says, hey, I'm going to go out and visit Susan in California. Now, keep in mind, he's saying he's going to use our money that Elaine and I and that he doesn't have to pay for a plane. And the plane ticket would be booked a couple days out. So very expensive. It wasn't like he was booking a deal. He books the ticket, he flies out, and now I'm left, having just come back up to Johnstown. I'm left with Lane and Reed, and I'm left to take care of them. And keep in mind, Lane, the poor guy, had gone through so much. He needed therapy, he needed help. And I wasn't sure what to do. So Jon's gone for, it was about a month. He's gone for a month. And now I'm trying to pay the bills and figure out what I'm doing. Um, at that time, Reed decided he was done with this whole mess, and I don't blame him at all. I'm really happy for him. I'm so proud of him. He decides to go visit some family members in Montana, or sorry, some friends in Montana, and spend a month with them. And then he said he was going to figure out what he was going to do. And I'm so proud of him. I'm glad that that was a decision he wanted. And so after a month, Reed decided that he wanted, unfortunately, to move up with my mom and be up with her in Canada. And at that time, I did tell Reed, I said, do you think that's a safe idea? And of course, he's so young and he doesn't have any way to support himself. And he knew that Reed knew, and he mentioned to me that Jon was so unstable, he didn't feel safe with Jon as his parent. And so the only option was to go up to Canada and spend time with Trish, which later would be a disaster and a very traumatic incident for Reed. So at the time, I just told him, I said, hey, stay in contact with me. I want to make sure you're okay. So now it's myself and Lane. And now the next thing happens. Lane, poor guy, starts to lose his sanity and he starts to have these rantings and these ravings because now he feels safe to do so, that Jon's out of the house. And he starts to be screaming and yelling and talking about his emotions. And I was happy to listen until he starts talking about his plan to decide that Jon should be here no longer. And when that happened, I knew, and Lane was giving specific details about how he would try to hurt Jon. And I want to say this really quickly in case Lane decides to speak. Lane told me based on the evil that dad has done, he shouldn't be here anymore. I hate him. I hate him so much. He's ruined my life. He's almost killed me, and he deserves to die. So I want to clarify and say I knew Lane from the time that he was born, and he and I were very close for a long time. And Lane was telling me once Jon left, we had lots of conversations, and Lane said, "This man is horrible. I hate him. I want to get out." And the problem I was put in was once he started talking about trying to do something to Jon, though I understood how he felt, I knew that something could happen. And so I had to tell Jon, and it killed me because I wish I had something else that I could have done to protect Lane. And so I had to tell Jon, I said, "Jon, Lane is saying things that are scaring me, that are making me feel unsafe, and I need you to do something." And so Jon, without providing proper care for Lane, sent Lane to grandparents, my dad's parents in California that Lane had never met. Did not tell his parents that Lane was in serious psychological distress. And so Lane goes out to Jon's parents. This was around October of 2016. And Lane has virtually no support system. He's in a bit of a better place. So now I'm here by myself in this apartment, and I'm not sure what to do. Uh, Jon then discloses to me after he came back for a short period. Oh, and I need to back up for a second. This was actually around the end of November. So what happened was Jon came back. I had already told him that Lane had threatened to end Jon's life. And then Lane got desperate. And so Lane poisoned himself and tried to commit suicide on Thanksgiving Day to get Jon's attention because Jon was ignoring him. And so it was after that that Jon, within a couple days of Lane being taken to the hospital, having his stomach pumped, his life was saved. And then Jon sends him right out to his parents. And I really want to add that because that's a key piece to show how negligent Jon is. Instead of admitting Lane to the psych ward and getting him some help, we would have qualified for that, by the way, because we were on Medicaid. And so Lane would have qualified for therapists. He would have qualified for help. And Lane was previously diagnosed as a child with autism and ADHD that was quite severe. And so his entire time growing up, my parents never got him any forms of assistance other than speech therapy. They never got him any kind of behavioral assistance. They never got him therapists. And so Lane was actually in the state of Pennsylvania, which has the highest rate of support for people with autism. And so here Lane has a suicide attempt, receives no care and concern from my dad. He comes home and Jon immediately pays for another plane ticket, sends Lane out, and Lane is just dumped off. And Jon's parents were never told what just happened. They had no idea what they were receiving. And so I'm in the house by myself, obviously traumatized. It's going into the Christmas season, and I'm just trying to figure out what to do. Jon then tells me he calls from California. He flew himself back out to California and he says, "Hey, I'm getting ready to propose to Susan and I'm getting ready to ask her to marry me." And I had so many feelings going on inside of me. And I realized, though, that that was my chance for Jon to leave and to never come back. And so I pretended to be happy and I said, "That's great." I said, "What do you need me to help with?" And my goal was to get him out as quickly as possible because I realized this was a major disaster. Nothing good was going to come from this. And so Jon spends his money. I don't know how much he spent. It was at least $2,000 to $6,000 based on what the ring looked like. He buys another wedding ring. He or an engagement ring, but he planned on and then did buy another wedding ring. And he proposes right before Christmas of 2016 to Susan. And then he begins to live in California permanently. And so that was the next change. He comes back near the new year of 2017 and tells me, "Hey, I'm just going to go ahead and move in because Susan and I know we want to be together. And so sorry, but you're going to have to figure out your own plans now." Now, during this time, for the first time in my life, I have finally started dating someone. My parents refused to let me date. They refused to help connect me with anyone. Like I said, they tried to betroth me. Jon will deny and say that was Trish, but Jon did not support me in that incident. And so I'm dating, I'm experiencing things for the first time as far as going on dates and that whole journey. And Jon's not there for any of that. Jon's not interested. He doesn't show any interest at all asking what's going on. And anytime I would talk about what was going on in my life, he wanted to play a therapist. He wanted to make me feel like I was a problem to be fixed. And he didn't talk with me as a dad would with a daughter. And so I then corresponded with him through the phone for quite some time. And I was getting to know what was going on in the relationship. So during this time, I decide, okay, I've got to do something. So I start looking into flight attending, and I decided that that was what I wanted to do. So I start pursuing flight attending. I got accepted. This was through the whole rest of 2017 into September or October. Jon still, during this time, has the apartment in Johnstown. And so I was paying rent and staying there all by myself. And then in September of 2017, when I got accepted for flight attendant school, Jon says, okay, well, since I'm living in California, we don't need that apartment. So let's go ahead and just uh, get rid of it. But the problem was, we had 20 years worth almost of things stuffed in the basement, our childhood memories, their wedding pieces, all of my dad's books. Our basement was very large and it was stuffed to the roof with boxes and boxes of Jon's books that he got from, again, Dr. Dobson and these harmful counseling resources. We had every piece of furniture you could imagine. And I said to him, well, what are you going to do with all this stuff? You're going to have to do something with it. And he says, oh, well, you could sell it for me. You could get rid of it. And then you can keep most of the money and just send me a little bit. And I wasn't sure what I thought of that. And so I didn't really give a yes or no answer. Um, and then Jon says, well, when are you finished with your schooling? I said, oh, it's about a month, end of October. He goes, okay, great. He goes, what we'll do, I'll fly back out. I'll go ahead. I'll help with the moving and we'll get that all fixed. And then I'll permanently move out to California with Susan and we'll just wait to get married. So I finished flight attending. I come back and I didn't know, because Jon had not disclosed this to me, that he expected me to help clean out the entire apartment. So I finished flight attendant school. I've had very little sleep. I'm supposed to have my test on the planes that you do to finish up your training. And so I did not have any help from Jon. I come back and he's all of a sudden on the phone helping Lane get a car. And keep in mind, Lane had not learned to drive. He was spending his money and later drove one of Jon's broken vehicles from Pennsylvania to California. That's how he left after he left me after flight attendant school, and gave Lane a car that later Lane just left broken down because it was such a piece of trash. And that vehicle was also a gift that Jon had received. Jon couldn't afford any extra vehicles. And so Jon comes back and he's all wrapped up with giving Lane this vehicle and he pays no attention to me. He doesn't help me pack up. And so because of that, I end up pulling an all-nighter trying to pack up my vehicle and take half of my stuff to my new apartment in Ohio. And it was about a 5-hour drive. So I drive all night, no help from Jon, and I go ahead and with zero sleep, I passed my flight test, my first flight test. I had been up for 48 hours. I get very little sleep, and then I have to drive back to Johnstown again to go get the rest of my stuff. And I go get the rest of my stuff, and then I have to pull another all-nighter because of how the flight schedules were structured. And I drive, and then I do my second flight test again, 48 hours of no sleep, and I end up just crashing afterward. And I crashing in the terms of sleep, not on the airplane. And I get my wings, I pass, I'm so proud of myself, and then I just sleep for 3 days straight. I'm so tired. Meanwhile, I have my phone on silent. Jon is bombarding my phone with text after text after text and calls. And I wake up on day 3 and I'm concerned, thinking, okay, this isn't like him. I reach out and I receive a very rude call from him. And he's like, why aren't you here to help me? I said, I just pulled all nighters. I just became a flight attendant. I'm going to be sleeping. And in the next 2 days, I'm going to have my first solo flight where I'm the only flight attendant with 50 people. I have to be rested. I have to make sure I know what I'm doing. And he begins to be extremely rude and almost yell at me, saying I've abandoned him. And I'm confused. And I say, well, you have people at church. Why don't you reach out to them? Ask, have you set up help? Do you have people that are there to support you? And he goes, well, no. But he didn't tell me that he'd already severed his ties and relationships because of how he'd been mistreating people at the church. This was the same church that gave the $1,500, and also Jimmy's church as well. And so I thought that was weird. And I was thinking, and by the way, he gave himself 3 weeks to clean out this entire place by himself, but he counted on me to drive back for the third time to help him. And I told him, and this is a safety risk. I'm going to sleep. I cannot help you. And I slept the entire 3 days. And then I had a very successful first flight. And I'm glad that I made that choice. But meanwhile, Jon, what I found out later, a week later, is Jon ended up taking everything in our entire house and all by himself, taking everything to Goodwill and the Salvation Army and dumping it off at the dump and getting rid of everything. And I want to just say, my parents were in debt for years because they bought all those things. And the value that I can figure, and one of my jobs is I sell secondhand online, so I can evaluate things pretty accurately. The evaluation of everything that was sold or that wasn't sold and that was just given away would have been at least $100,000. There were some very expensive things, multiple vehicles, and some pieces, as I said, that also my grandmother and my mother took up to Canada, and we could have easily had $100 to $130,000. And so all of that, instead of him deciding to make use of that, he gives himself 3 weeks. He loses about $100,000 or more. He takes broken down vehicles, gives me a vehicle, as I said before, that almost killed me and my husband, and wastes all that money. And then he told me, I'm bringing out some stuff I saved for you, and then I'm gone. And he was very rude to me in that. And I said, okay, well, that's fine. And I told him 3 times, don't stress about it. If it's too much, don't worry about it. I don't need that stuff. I've already got some things from my multiple all nighters that I had to do. I said, I don't want you to stress more. So he made it a point to go through the whole house in the basement and save all the stuff that I wouldn't want, purposely as a backslap to show me you didn't help me, so you get the last scraps. He saved tarps and bungee cords. He saved old lamps. He saved very random items that I wouldn't need purely and gave away all of the special things that he knew were mine. And he purposely did that to show me that he wasn't going to take that kind of quote betrayal. So he dumps off, he opened up the storage unit for me that I really didn't want and that I was paying for in Ohio. And he just comes one rainy day and just dumps it all off and then drives away. Barely says hi to me. So there I am for 6 hours having to pack up this storage unit with very heavy items. And I'm just reflecting on what kind of crappy behavior that was. And it wasn't until a couple weeks later that I find out that he simply just got rid of everything by himself for 3 weeks. 3 weeks, almost didn't sleep. He was extremely dangerous. He drove across from Pennsylvania to California with virtually no sleep with a giant moving truck. And I can't believe that he didn't accidentally kill someone because he was so tired. He had about 2 hours of sleep for 3 weeks per night, and he looked like a wreck when I saw him. And so I never heard from him for several weeks after that, and I was confused. He had never told me what his expectations were. So I'm flight attending. I'm not hearing much from Lane and Reed right now. Jon arrives in California, and I don't hear anything. And I'm worried. I'm going, is he okay? Did he make it? I'm not hearing anything from Susan. So on one of my trips, I check in and I'm like, hey, haven't heard anything. How's it going? And I don't get a response. And then I get a really rude text that says, you know what you did? Why would I take my time and talk to someone that betrays their dad after all I've done for you? And I'm very confused. And I text back, we should probably talk about this on the phone. I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. And he basically then texts back, yes, you do know, and calls me a liar. And so we have a conversation, and he very short, it was about 5 minutes long, and he says, based on the fact that you acted like you weren't my daughter because you didn't come to my help in time of need. And I proceeded to interrupt him and say, so I could be safe and make sure I didn't endanger people. He goes, that doesn't matter. I'm your dad. Do you know what I've done for you in your life? And you couldn't even come to my aid. And I said, well, you gave yourself 3 weeks. He goes, don't interrupt me. I said, what person doesn't ask for help and gives themselves 3 weeks? And basically, he hung up on me. So I don't hear from him for at least almost 2 more months. And by this time, it's almost Christmas of 2017. This is almost a year later, beginning of 2018. And I start to hear from Lane and Reed that some very sketchy and scary stuff is going on with them and Trish. So by this time, Lane has moved from his grandparents. He's been homeless, had no support, and he's been given psychological medication. I don't know who took him to the doctor, but he at least got that, but he wasn't taking his medication. And so my grandparents were totally unprepared for what they were dealing with. This is John's parents. So they decide to send him to Canada to live with Trish, the same person that endangered him. And I was so angry when I heard this. This was around January of 2018. And so John starts slowly talking to me after he posted this letter, by the way, on Twitter, where it shows me feeling the need to apologize to him for what happened. And I just want to say the conversation before, John had gaslit me once again, and I wasn't fully healed. I wasn't at the place where I could deny that shame and say that's not true. And so, unfortunately, I felt like I had to own something that I did that was terrible towards him when it should be the opposite. And he should have gotten on his hands and knees and begged for my forgiveness. But after all the lies he told and the disaster that he made my life, but instead he turned it around and he made me feel like God was going to destroy my life and ruin everything I'd worked for. And so that letter was gaslighting. That letter was the result of him gaslighting me. And I felt that the only way to have him in my life was to say nice things and make him feel good about himself. And again, I totally uh, wish that I hadn't done that. Now I would have a very different response, which is just be to ignore him. Part of the reason that I stayed in contact with him is because he was gatekeeping information to Trish and Lane and Reed. And so I felt that my only line of keeping them safe was, because I still intended to be their guardian if something went wrong, was making sure that I could stay in contact with John so he could tell me what was going on. He positioned himself, which is ironic considering that my brother Lane is now held hostage up in Canada still, and John will have nothing to do with Lane. And so it's just, and I reached out to John. I want to spring forward to now and just say, 6 months ago, I had texted John's multiple numbers as well as Susan's, and they never got back to me. I said, "Do you know Lane's number? Do you have an email? Do you have a contact?" Lane doesn't have any social media, any way for me to contact him. I said, "Is there a way that I can get a hold of my brother?" And they never responded. And they purposely ignored me. I used every phone number and email possible. And so they refused to give me that information. So going back to 2018, I'm starting to hear some very scary things. I'm hearing that Trish is talking about killing herself. Reed's starting to reach out to me and say, uh, Trish has been talking to herself again. She's starting to act very weird. Trish had started dating another man during that time. Now, keep in mind, she was the one that filed divorce. John wouldn't file divorce at all, even though he was living in California with Susan. So John has not filed divorce. Trish files divorce, but then John files back into the divorce. And as the two people that they are, Trish refused to sign the papers because she was again baiting John. So she files for divorce. John files an answer, and then she files refusing to sign the divorce papers because that's what she would do as a control move. So now they're at a standstill. No divorce is moving forward. Trish is dating. John is living with the woman that he grew up in high school with. He even told me inappropriate details such as, "Oh, well, we're not having intimacy. We're not having sex. We're just going to live together because we basically should be married. And as soon as Trish signs the papers, we're going to get married the next day," which is exactly what happened about 5 months later. So Trish is starting to do some very scary things and repeating what happened back in Johnstown. And I start telling John, "You need to do something and make sure." John's not intervening. And he keeps telling me, they're almost grown up. They can handle this. They're going to be fine, which was shocking to me. The man that had bragged about being a great dad. And so all of a sudden, I'm at work. It's about May. And I got a call from John that says, Trish tried to kill herself. She's now in the psych ward in the Vancouver area. And I'm like, "What?" He says, "Yeah, what I heard from, I think it was Reed, is that they were in the apartment and she started threatening to kill herself, or she did something and Reed knew he needed to call 911 and he did. And so by now, the whole of her family knows what's going on because it happened in the private home, so they didn't know. Reed is now thrown into the middle of the situation. Trish is in the psych ward up in Vancouver. And then I didn't hear anything from them for a while. And I would reach out to Reed, and he didn't tell me much. But I was concerned for their safety. And again, Jon could have done something, but he didn't. And then it was July, so 2 months had passed, and I learned from either Reed or Jon that Trish had been moved to a long-term care unit because she wasn't getting better. And um, Trish uh, then started doing some very dangerous to herself and other things. She started wandering the different rooms. She started talking about Jesus coming and about the fact that everybody was going to die in fire, and walking into everyone's room, singing them songs, waking up in the middle of the night, talking to herself, getting undressed and laying on the floor, and just very strange stuff. And I will say, I do believe that she had a psychotic break. And this is very controversial, and I can already feel that people are going to be thinking this. Um, she had pushed herself to such a point through the years of her belief that she was in control, that suddenly when she wasn't, and I do need to add, she would bombard me with email after email. I had to send her email to spam. This is after she went up to Canada. She would send me with email after email threatening me, telling me that she hated me, telling me that she wished death on my new husband, telling me all these horrible things. And she was very coherent in those emails. She was very aware, and she had a history of pretending she was non functioning. And then she would, behind the scenes, be lying about it. Very tricky behavior. And so I just want to clarify and say, based on her intellect with her writing, there was no way that she was out of it as much as she was acting like she was, which again was for attention. And then I find out after all of that that one day she's not being supervised. She was put, it was so bad that she was put on a 24-hour watch. So she was not left unattended. Well, I believe that she tried to trick the attendees and get them to leave the room. And I remember hearing that she said something like, I need some privacy. And they were not supposed to leave her unattended. And whatever happened, they come back, find her in the closet. She had decided to stuff rags down her throat, and that's how she asphyxiated herself. They find her loss of consciousness. They were able apparently to bring back her heartbeat. And then from that moment forward, her whole family decided to keep her in a vegetative state on life support. And this is, again, this has been about 3 months that this has been happening. Poor Lane and Reed are experiencing all of this. They're living together at this apartment by themselves. Um, Reed apparently was being made by the family that's holding Lane hostage, was forced to come visit her and see her in that state. And I could tell it traumatized him. And I know that he has said he prefers not to speak. And I'm going to say I understand. After what he saw and witnessed, I can't imagine how scarring that must have been for him. Reed later came to live with me after I offered some support, since he was living in very unsafe housing in the Vancouver area. And I'll get to that. Jon cut off financial support to Reed after screaming at me, saying that I was making Reed poor. It was about 2 weeks after that that Jon cut financial support to Reed. And I know that because I asked Reed the timing. Reed told me, and I knew that Jon was going to do that. He always talks about being generous and threatens right before he decides to cut it anyways. He's had a pattern of that. And so Reed was living in very unsafe housing with about almost 20 other people. They were in a very um, low income situation that was quite scary. And Reed showed me pictures of where he was living. And so I had said to him in 2020, would you please come live with us? I would like for you to have a place to stay. Jon was not talking to me, was not supportive, but all that to say, I really cared about how my brothers were doing. So Trish is in a vegetative state. Jon's not talking at all. He keeps telling me that because now she can't sign the divorce, maybe once whatever happens, either she wakes up or they pull the plug. And he says, once that happens, now I can finally get married to Susan, which was such an insensitive thing to say. I didn't feel any feelings of my mom being a parent. I didn't feel any feelings of love. It had been 4 years since I talked to her. And so even though I didn't feel close to Trish, it was still such a knife to the heart that Jon would say that, and very insensitive. And apparently he was also saying that to Reed as well. So it's near the end of August. I'm married now. I'm experiencing married life and just trying to build a home. And then I find out that her family decided to pull life support, which I knew they would need to do anyways. And I knew that she either probably wasn't there, or that was what was the best decision. And so they still had Reed be part of that entire thing. This is the family that's holding Lane. They forced Reed to be part of that, and they didn't give him a say in what happened to his own mother. And Jon was not supportive of Reed. And I just remember it was very difficult for Reed to talk. And they had the funeral, and of course, I didn't go and attend, because even though I had told her family all of the abuse that had happened when I lived with them years ago, they refused to support me. And they were very cruel and rude to me. And I came to find out they also were very cruel to Lane and Reed as well. And so this wasn't unique to just myself. So they have the funeral. I don't attend. Lane and Reed were made to attend. I don't know if they were comfortable with that. Um, Again, they decide to have Trish cremated without asking Lane and Reed if they're okay with that. They never checked with me. They purposely were ghosting me, Trish's family. They never asked any consent on my part, after stealing almost $25 to $30,000 worth of items from me, and never sent them back, never gave them back. And so here Lane and Reed are with no parents at all. Reed, I think, had just turned 18. He just had reached adulthood. He wasn't finished high school yet. And so he had to take a break in his schooling because of everything that was happening. Um, and so after the funeral, Reed gets a call from his uncle Jay, who's the one holding Lane hostage. And Jay has a history of physical violence, and Jay is a very dangerous person. And you wonder where Trish got this from. Her family and Jon's family have exhibited some very concerning traits. And so Jay screams at Reed on the phone and says, "You better get out of that apartment. I'm taking everything. I'm taking all the furniture. I'm taking all the money. I'm taking the deposit that Reed had helped pay for. It was like $1,000." And he says, "And you better leave or I'm calling the police. I'm getting a restraining order." And then Jay called the landlord and threatened him so badly. The landlord called Reed and said, "Hey, I'm so sorry. I need you to leave. I need to make sure that I'm not hurt," because Jay had threatened to punch the landlord in the face. This was a long-standing history. This is why Trish had these characteristics. Her family is like that. And so Reed, in about a week, has to pack up and leave, doesn't get to take any of the furniture. Again, there was at least $8,000 worth of furniture, and Reed actually said he wanted to sell that to get money. So Reed has to move in to this unsafe housing, and he has nowhere to go. He has no money. He unfortunately was caught up in a pyramid scheme that, because he was talked into it because he didn't have any way to survive. He's still in high school, and I'm really concerned for him. And unfortunately, due to the pyramid scheme, he starts not to talk to me because the company would tell him, if there's a family member that doesn't like the business, don't talk to us. So now I'm losing contact with Reed. I later regained contact with him, and I think he's out of that now. But that was really scary. So now I'm losing contact with Reed. He's part of a known Canadian pyramid scheme. And now I hear that Lane is being forced to move in with Trisha's family. And I knew, and this is what happened. I told Jon, I said, they're going to use Lane as a pawn. I said, so Lane's about 21 at this time. And I said, because Lane has actual disabilities, he has almost level 2 autism, he has ADHD, he has had that since he was 2. And they're not getting him support and medication like he needs. I said, I want to have guardianship over him. Jon did not really acknowledge that. He just said, well, Lane's an adult, he can handle himself. Um, and so from then on until now, Trisha's family, and this is what I experienced when I lived there, they are gouging Lane for the money that he's earning from his minimum wage job. They're charging him rent, they're charging him room and board, they're taking his money from him. They are refusing to let him, and they're in an area of the suburbs of Vancouver where there's no bus system, there's no vehicles. They refuse to let anyone drive, and so he has no access to anything. And it would be at least 40 miles to anywhere close. So realistically, there's no way for him to get out. And so I lived in that same home that they have currently where Lane is. And so after experiencing the mistreatment from them so badly that I felt like I had to leave after only 5 months of being with them, I knew Lane was in danger. And so I said, Jon, I said, Lane is going to be threatened by Jay. Trisha's parents, June and Dawn Brecknell, they're going to control his every move, and Lane, having disability, isn't going to know how to set boundaries. He's never had that chance. Jon did nothing. He said again, he's an adult. Based on how Lane has, quote, treated me, why should I do anything for him? He said that. And that's what happened. And so to this day, um, Lane is still being held hostage in that situation. And Jon has shown no care and concern for that. Uh, Thankfully, and I'll get to Jon's story in a second, um, eh, Reed then moved in with myself and my husband and had a couple months with us, and then he met someone that he got married to my knowledge that he's married, and they now have a beautiful baby girl, and he's back in Vancouver, and interestingly has no contact that I know of, very little contact with Jon. I know he's still, I believe, in contact, but no contact with the family of Trish, and I hope the best for Reed that he's starting his life. Going back to Jon, so after Trish in late August was pulled off of life support, Jon actually got married uh, through an elopement at the courthouse in Northern California. I believe it was the day after she ended up being pulled off of life support while the funeral was happening. It could have been a couple days after that, but was it within a day? And so Trish, the divorce papers, I believe, were never fully signed. I'm having trouble remembering that, but I don't believe the divorce papers were signed, and they got married. Um, and then I really didn't hear anything. But what I do know happened with Jon, going back to him, is he continued to work on Church Protect. He continued to work on building businesses. And at this point, and he told me this, he was now without a job still, and he'd been without a job for about 2 years. It was 2 to 2.5 years before he got employed. He now starts working on a license in California, and I don't know if he completed that, but he starts working on a license. And his new wife, Susan, she had a teaching career, and Susan had saved up, from what they told me, it was, I think, $200,000 to $300,000 in retirement. She's been a teacher for quite some time, so about $200,000 to $300,000 in retirement, or $200,000 to $300,000 in retirement. And Jon told me after they'd been living off of that, um, Susan had a traumatic brain injury, so she couldn't work during that time. So they were living off of the savings. And Jon then tells me after 2.5 years, because we've bought such expensive organic food, and again, my parents, Jon and Trish, were in debt constantly because they would buy things they couldn't afford. They, as part of the whole Illuminati fundamentalist, there was a big movement about organic clean eating, and many people I knew would spend thousands of dollars, sometimes $100,000 a year, on these supplements and these products, and that's what was happening. So Jon, with, I believe, with Susan's consent, they spent almost all of her retirement funds, from what Jon and Susan both told me, in a span of 2.5 years, on these natural supplements and products. And Jon, again, starting a business. And so you see him again using another female to build a business, to exploit her, whether she knows it or not. And, I believe that she thinks he's the best person in the world and that he treats her pretty well. The thing is, she's very different from Trish in her personality, and I'm afraid that she might be the kind of person that is not quite as aware and knows the kind of tricks Jon's pulling. So anyway, Jon was not having success finding a job in California. So he starts looking everywhere. He starts again taking the money they're living off of and flying out to find different new opportunities. Jon eventually, and I wasn't part of this entirely. Jon and I were still talking at this time. This is before he screamed at me. He screamed at me. It was around February of 2020. So this was between 2018 to 2020. He finally finds a position in Blythewood, South Carolina, and he takes Susan, packs up everything again, drives across the whole country using their funds. But the concerning thing is, Jon decided that he was going to fulfill, quote, his dreams of living on a golf course. And so you picture a financial state of he doesn't yet have a job that has actually started. He's heading out to a job and he decides, and I've looked at the financial records of this home, so I know this is correct. If you look up, and I'm not going to say his address, but if you look up his exact address where he lives, it's a very posh, nice neighborhood. And the house price that it sold for was around $350,000 back in 2020. It's since gone up. And so he gets a mortgage for a $350,000 home that he can't afford. And he told me that. And he's living on a golf course, and I've used Google Maps to prove to myself that this is a neighborhood that it's a 5-bed 3-bath home, as they told me. They sent pictures. It's way above his income level that he can afford. And according to him, the most outrageous lie that he told me, and I know it was a lie, he said the reason we got this house is because we can't wait for you and Lane and Reed to have bedrooms to come live and come stay. This was after I was married. And that definitely didn't sit right with me. That was very creepy. I've never heard of a dad saying that when you've abandoned your children and now they're all adults and they're all almost in their 20s. And so he lied for the reason of having such a large house and said, we got such a large house for you all. Never even consulted us. I didn't even know he had a new home. He hadn't talked to me for 2 months. So, from my knowledge, what I've seen online, what Jimmy has told me, Jon began to become abusive to Jimmy Hinton. Jon began to do his classic move where he didn't disclose to Jimmy how much work Jimmy would need to do to start Church Protect and to keep it going and all of the behind the scenes details. And Jon starts accusing Jimmy of not fulfilling his end of the bargain. And Jimmy told me this. And I remember hearing Jon say his perspective, but Jon had done this consistently. So this was no surprise. And so Jimmy says, Jon screamed at me while I was getting ready for vacation. And he says, you're not holding up your end of the bargain after all I've done for you, which is Jon's key phrase that he uses. After all I've done for you, how could you renege on our partnership in not putting in the time and effort like I have? And keep in mind, Jon has not been focused on the business. He's been distracted and doing all sorts of other things. So he blames Jimmy, saying, you've been the worst partner ever. I don't ever want to work with you again. You are a wolf in sheep's clothing. And Jon will call people wolves. That's his favorite phrase to use. And he said it's his favorite phrase. And he was nasty. And so Jimmy decides this is not working. He ends the business partnership. And I want to make this clear. Jimmy ended the business partnership in a very mature fashion. And Jon huffed out of there and was having a hissy fit and was extremely rude and abusive. And Jon is still working though. So what Jon does is he takes Church Protect and I believe he tries to put it in his name when it still had intellectual property from Jimmy. So he's stealing again, and we could say forging intellectual property from another person, which is something that Jon has done consistently. During this time, from what I'm aware of, Jon was fired from the position that had hired him in Blythewood. And so now Jon told me when I was still talking with him, this is in about 2019, Jon tells me, hey, I've been deciding I'm going to do online therapy like BetterHelp and provide counseling services online since I can't find a job and since nothing's really working. And I don't know what became of that. He is belligerent enough that he's going to try to act like he should be taking over the business. And so what I've seen from him is he goes into a situation, a church or a business, and tries to tell them how to run the business from day one. And as you know, many people don't take kindly to that. you need to give people credit where credit's due, and Jon doesn't do that. He wants all the credit. So if I know Jon, the reason why he's been getting let go from these different businesses is because the confidence and then the decision that he makes to take over these businesses is not well received. That is my take on what's been going on. Again, Jon really lost contact with me during that time. And so he has not had consistent employment since he got let go from the prison. And I want to make this really clear. This is the big bombshell. Jon does not know, as I said before, Jon doesn't know how to keep a job if it's not on his terms. Jon doesn't know how to run a business fully. Jon, he can run a podcast, he can run smaller things, but the way Jon portrays himself, he doesn't have the skills to do that, and he won't take the time and learn. He expects everyone else to do that for him. So where he is now is he is trying to scrape together every resource possible that he can, because as he told me, he's scared he's going to lose his mortgage. And this is where it's really sinister. He buys a place because he believes he deserves it. He used to talk growing up to me that he wanted to live in a golf course and have a house just like where they live now. And he blamed Trish for never being able to afford this home when he was the main reason we were so in debt. Again, had a bankruptcy almost too. And so Jon then in 2020, after he's having no luck with employment, he calls me to say, hey, why haven't you paid the $200 for the vehicle, the broken down vehicle with the transmission issue that I gave you? And I told him we've had some struggles. And so that's where he revealed and screamed at me, and I could tell he was desperate. And that's where he said, we aren't going to be able to make our mortgage. You're causing us to be poor. We may be homeless soon, and God is going to work against you. And then he said, and you're preventing your brother Reed from supporting himself. And he screamed all of that, which I'm not going to do here. And that told me, and that was the last time I talked to him, that told me this man is actually scared. He has not set himself up the way that a homeowner would. He doesn't know how to keep a home. He's never owned a home before. He never did the kind of yard work, the kind of maintenance. I mean, imagine if something breaks in that home, he doesn't have the money to fix it. So he is now desperate. And as far as I know, that's where he's been. And I see him trying to portray himself online as a person that's successful, has all these ventures. He has never reached out to Lane, never reached out to me. And he used to tell us as kids, if you ever rebel as an adult, you can believe you'll never hear from me again. And if I know my dad and his dad are some of the most stubborn people I've ever met. And he means that. So I don't ever expect to hear from my dad. But I want to make this clear. He's putting this online image that I'm close to him, that he's been an amazing dad. And I'll let you be the judge of that from what you've just heard. But Reed, I believe, may be in contact with Jon, but he's cut his entire family, his entire kids off, and has never seen his first grandchild. I don't know about his second grandchild, but basically, if I were to sum up Jon's absolute titanic disaster of a career and of a life, it's, and he said this, I want to say this came back to me. He screamed at me, I don't have any savings. I don't have any retirement. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get Social Security, because he's been a business owner. And that's part of what happens when you're a business owner, but he doesn't know that. And he screams, I'm going to be working until the day I die, until my 90s, because I don't have anything to take care of me. And it hit me. That's why he needs women. That's why he needs me. That's why he needs females' money to pay him to counsel them. And that's where I really want to leave this. Jon is looking for females who have needs to pay for his bills because he can't afford them. And that's a terrible reason to be a therapist. That's a terrible reason to believe that you should fund. And I want to say to anyone who's listening that might be supporting him, your finances are funding Jon's lifestyle that he believes he deserves, which is a very nice house they can't afford on a golf course in a place a lot of us would like to live. But that's not the problem. The problem is he doesn't really care about you. He cares about himself. And if you're okay with supporting someone like that, that's up to you. But I just want to let people know Jon is greedy. And he won't portray that, of course, on the outside. But Jon views any venture that he has really as he wants to be famous. He wants to have power. And if you're someone who is supporting him, just know you're supporting that. I can't speak for Susan. I will say that she's either extremely brainwashed or she's supporting Jon. As far as I know, she's fully supportive and she has cut me off as well. And so it's really sad that Jon really truly believes, and you could see this from his writing online. Jon truly believes that he's won. He truly believes he has it all. And I am afraid, especially through this exposure that Matt is providing, he is about to take a serious fall. And I'm predicting that right now. I'm predicting that this is the beginning of a serious moment of reflection in his life for one of the very first times he's ever had. And I mean that. Jon has never taken the time to reflect on the choices and being an adult, really. I see a very little child inside of him. I see someone who believes he should have it without having to work for it, and that is reflected in his relationships and in how he comes across. And so if someone asked me what would you say, I would say grow up, reflect, own what you've done, go off, never bother anyone again, live a private life, and go work at Walmart. Go see how that feels. Go put your hands, do what the rest of us are doing. Stop trying to make a name for yourself, and especially stop being a wolf in sheep's clothing. Stop hunting down victims and making money off of them. You have no place in their life. And the last thing I want to say is maybe, Jon, the reason why your life has been a disaster is because you are the reason for the disaster. And as someone who is now on the new phase of her life, I can say with sadness and also with pride, whenever I look at my life, I ask myself, what would my parents have done? And then I do the complete opposite. And so far, my life's been going pretty well. And so, unfortunately for me, I have my parents to look to, Jon and Trish, to say, here's what not to do. Here's the legacy you should never leave your children. And so, I will say tongue in cheek, Jon, you've taught me how not to be. And I'm very thankful that I've learned that lesson the way that I have. And so, to anyone that is in the space that he has hurt, that he has spoken to, I want you to know you don't need to listen to Jon. It's been a journey for me to have to say, even though he's my dad, I have to separate myself from that. I'm not going to let toxic people speak into my life. And just so you know, your journey is your own. It's special. And don't just hand it to anyone. And Jon is certainly not that person that you should be giving that to. And I hope that Jimmy and the people that have been damaged understand that Jon is never a reflection on them, and that I'm really proud of people for speaking out, and I'm thankful. And again, Matt, thank you so much for this opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Nicole Uhler, the daughter of Jon Uhler, thank you so much. You have been absolutely magnificent. And it is incredible, actually, how you have been able to just lay this all out for us. And, I'm hoping that you're right. I'm hoping that when I click publish, that it is, a kind of reflective moment for Jon. As a matter
Mm,
of fact, I will be hitting him up before publication with a formal list of questions, not Twitter questions, but real questions, now that you have corrected the record on a number of matters. So
thank you.
I just want to thank you for helping us to know what is true and what is not. Um, and so with that, I hope that you will be well after this and that you feel at the end of this process like you have basically purged the old life, perhaps, and get closure out of this process.
Well, I certainly do. And I thank you for helping to be a part of that healing for myself and others. And I'm excited to see the possible momentum from here and what happens once this is published.
Nicole Uhler, our heroine of the hour.